Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our astrological festival. Today's guest is Edith Hathaway, who is going to talk about Vedic astrology, her area of expertise, and some of the latest transits and how they have influenced us so far. Thank you very much, Edith, for coming today, for giving us a bit of your time.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Well, firstly, I'd like to ask you, how do you think your interest in astrology started? Like, what do you think brought you to this discipline?
I think I was led there because I wasn't surrounded by it growing up. I was deep into music and the performing arts. I gravitated towards music. I was a pianist. I was a composer. I accompanied everything, when I was growing up. I was into dance. I was into theater. I later moved into some publishing, but it was not in my world, not until the mid 70s, and I encountered my first brush with astrology, shall we say, other than horoscopes in the newspaper. I mean, it wasn't presented to me as a serious thing that you could, career or activity that you could go towards. So it just wasn't around me. I was living in England. I lived in London for 6 years, and just towards the end of that, I was encountering some astrology, and somebody did a tarot reading for me. They didn't even really know what they were doing. They were looking at a book. And ironically, well, I don't know, maybe providentially, it was all accurate. And so it got me intrigued about systems of um, foretelling, systems that where you can investigate things. So I think the investigator in me got engaged. How could we look at certain things and know them? And for me, it wasn't like, oh, I want to study psychology now. It wasn't that. I gravitated more towards metaphysics, that kind of thing. And yeah, and then when I moved from Europe to back to the States, and I grew up in New England, the Boston area, but I moved to Manhattan, New York City. And there I was more surrounded by it. And there were bookstores full of books on astrology, Zoltan Mason's bookstore in particular. So that kind of began things. I began studying it on the side. I was doing music. And I think the music, I was told by one very great mentor, he said, the music brought you to it. Because my head would be flooded with music in the morning. But what is music? Music is a large system of symbols that you have to read and make some harmonious sense out of. So it's very similar in many ways, and you're trying to make sense of the world, the universe, and at the same time, and you're not necessarily thinking of this as a young person, but you're not thinking about knowledge leading you to wisdom. Although I grew up in a Christian environment, the Judeo-Christian system, which is the backbone of the United States. And what I found the deeper I went into astrology is that it is indeed a sacred system. So it brought me deeper back into that whole thing, which is not what I originally went towards it for. I went towards it as an investigative tool. And so much I guess I'm answering more than you asked, but that's what drew me in. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you. So since you've had a bit of experience now, what do you think brought you specifically to the Vedic side of astrology?
Well, again, I think one is led. I studied all these, and I published a book on Western astrology called Navigating by the Stars. So I wrote that in 1988, and it was a couple of years before I found a publisher. In those days, there was no well, it was more vanity publishing if you published it yourself. So you had to find a publisher. So I did publish under Llewellyn in 1991, but I had actually written the book several years earlier. And you could say of course, I tend to look at Jupiter and Saturn cycles a lot, as you see from my book. But I started studying astrology in 1976.
Right.
And it was, as you probably know, no doubt, it's a 12-year or 11.9 to be exact, year cycle that is the Jupiter cycle. And literally 12 years later, in 1988, I stumbled upon Vedic astrology. And it was like, something coming at you. Client came to me and said, well, this Vedic astrologer said this, this, and this. And she was insistent that I find it in Western tropical astrology, almost like she was offended that because she knew the Western system and how could the Vedic get it and the Western not, right? So I rolled up my sleeves and I had all these tools. I'd studied so hard, and I had the Uranian system, and I'd studied. There were, you pick and choose, as you know. I wasn't that. I didn't gravitate that much towards the asteroids, but the Uranian system I thought was excellent, and but long and short, I could not find what that astrologer had come up with. So I promptly booked an appointment with that astrologer who was in Los Angeles. His name was Chakapani Ulal. He's now no longer with us. He passed in 2017. And he became my mentor, actually. Not immediately, but in the long run, he became my mentor, a very, very important person to me. And actually, I was in Manhattan, I was in New York City, but moved west with my then boyfriend, fiance. We married when we lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It turned out later that we discovered I moved there from the East Coast the exact same day that David Frawley moved there from the West Coast. He's a well-known Vedic astrologer and pundit. He's written some major books, the early ones, which influenced me a lot. Astrology of the Seers is an excellent book. And so he also lived in Santa Fe, but it wasn't. I knew him actually through my then husband knew him, and so we'd see each other socially. But then in 1988, I had this, as I say, challenge from a client, and so as you can see, it was kind of like, you're okay. We want you to do this now, kind of thing. I now see it like that. At the time, it was like, oh, I can study this and I'll add it on to what else I'm doing. You see, that was my initial thought. Far be it for me to think at the time that I would put aside even the zodiac I was using, because I was using the tropical zodiac. So, but I did move to the sidereal zodiac. And you could say, why? Well, my own chart, because that's the linchpin that we judge many things. Like, hey, is it making sense for me? Does it fit you can use that as a test, and I'm sure many astrologers do. And then we test many other things. But I found it to be a much more accurate representation of my own chart, including with the sidereal zodiac. It was a deeper, clearer, purer. Now, not that the other one, I don't mean to cast aspersion on the Western astrologers or anything about the system. It's just that for me, it resonated much more deeply. Plus, I love the language of it, and I love the way the whole sacred system, from the Rig Vedas, the Upanishads. I mean, it's a very deep, very ancient system. Some of my detractors initially said, well, this isn't your culture. But it's like, it's just as close to the Western mind, really. It's as close. I find no contradiction from the tenets of, say, Christianity. Now, there are more deities. There are more deities in charge of things. But the depth of the sacred view of life, which is something that is in danger right now. So we'll get into that. With all this things going on with, God being essentially declared dead, and let's become a machine and merge with the machine. All of the promises of and edicts, in fact, of artificial intelligence. And maybe you can program astrology with a robot, artificial intelligence, but I don't believe you can replace the human being. I mean, basically, we're talking about Homo sapiens too here with the artificial intelligence. So I believe astrology has an important role to play there. So the depth, oh God, there's certain passages, I don't think I didn't bring it into the room, but there's an amazing passage from the Upanishads that is about, if I can remember it, like two birds of golden plumage,
Right.
inseparable companions, the individual self and the immortal self with a capital S, are perched on the branches of the self-same tree. The former tastes of the sweet and bitter fruits of the tree, the latter tasting of neither, calmly observes. And then it goes on about how when you're deluded, the individual self deluded by forgetfulness of his identity with the divine self and
Right.
bewildered by his identity with the ego, grieves and is sad. But when he remembers his identity with his, now I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but when he remembers his identity with the divine self, he grieves no more. So I think that whole is very poetic, very deep. I mean, it's so condensed and poetic, which is what I find all through Vedic astrology, that the soul, the life of the soul, is there. And it's so astonishing, you find, as an astrologer. And this is another reason, and you'll hear this from many Western tropical astrologers who moved to Vedic astrology, that the accuracy, and it did attract me. I thought, well, if there's a system that's more accurate than the one I was using, I'm going to learn it. And that's another answer to your question earlier. So that was, yeah. Oh, good. This is great. I'll add this. But you got two different systems.
Right.
And my advice also would be, and it's not like somebody couldn't do both, and people do merge, they prefer to use a round chart. I worked closely with, he was my mentor and my friend, and he was a colleague, Chakapani, and I worked closely with the Indian astrologers. So I became more of a purist to use their charts, use their format, use the rectangular format. I use the South Indian format.
Right.
I have both of those at my website so that people get a quick bird's eye view, like, okay, this is how to get oriented.
Right.
But that's definitely an attraction. But the idea that you can look at the whole life and see when certain things, this is the other thing, aside from the transits, and again, secondary progressions are not something that are used. But the dashas, we have dasha systems, which are systems of planetary periods. They have 55 of them. And these people invented chess, don't forget. So there's incredible techniques, but you can't use 55 systems. You can't use 55 dasha systems. So they advise that people use one or two. So I use the main one that it's called the Vimshotri dasha system. It means 120. The 120 being the ideal length of life. Can you believe? Some yogis, in fact, we did meet some yogis in India who were nearly 100, they were over 110.
Oh.
And just in magnificent physical specimens and sharp as a tack. And had been doing astrology for over 60 years. They didn't need to look at a chart to know your chart. I mean, the realm of enlightened beings. And it's not like every street corner, but there are some amazing sages that are in India, and I was privileged to meet a couple of them and to have one as a mentor.
Of course. Well, definitely. I can definitely, feel your excitement about it. You mentioned that of course, we've faced some challenges, but we're also going to be facing more challenges, also relating to how technology will influence us and how, our relationship with ourselves and the world will change. So, from your observations, what do you think? What are the main things that are really going to be changing for us in these years? Like, can you give us, a look, your perspective?
Right. I think this might be a time to do that screen share. And I'll first mention, I showed you the picture of this is my book called In Search of Destiny, which is biography, history, and culture as told through Vedic astrology. I also have the French version of that.
Great.
So yes, so any of your viewers are fluent in French. So maybe so some of this is covered in my 2012 book, but not the visuals. So as I had told you before we started, that maybe this would be a good time. Let's see. So I'll do the screen share. And let's see what I want to do. Okay, so I wanted to do this because I could talk about this without the graph, but I know a lot of people are helped by the visual. So first of all, for people who are viewing this and who are Western tropical astrologers, first thing you have to remember that this is the sidereal zodiac, and I use the Lahiri Ayanamsha. So when I say the core of the Earth period, so I conceived of these charts, and my webmaster executed them for me in 2019. So I wish I'd had these in 2012 for my book, but this helps you to see. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about these larger Jupiter-Saturn cycles, which help us to view time. Now, the Vedic system has these Kali yugas, you've probably heard of, hundreds of thousands of years or 432,000 years. But, your eyes kind of glaze over trying to conceive of that time period. So the Jupiter-Saturn cycles, and individually and together, are much more conducive to human beings understanding them in real time, for eras outside of historical eras before us and eras to come. So what I've done, and I'm certainly not the only astrologer to examine Jupiter-Saturn cycles, but and we all know, astrologers know that they're socioeconomic, political cycles, but they are definitely affected by what element they're in. And then further, we look at now, can you see my pointer or no? Probably not.
But you can tell me where to point and I'll do it.
Yeah. So like just underneath where the Aries is in the middle at 2000, you'll see something that says Kritika. The things that are in parenthesis beneath the degree and the sign, those are nakshatras. Nakshatras run for 13 degrees, 20 minutes of each sign. There are 27 of them. So we have further details. I won't go into a lot of that because that's, a little over technical. But we see that in what's outlined there in gold is what I call the core of the Earth cycle, where there are success of my rule of thumb that I decided it had to be. You had to have at least 2 conjunctions in a row. In other words, every 20 years that were in the same element. So in 1961, it says 60, but actually the conjunction was in early February, I think 18th of 1961. so you had the conjunction there that was in Earth, and then there were three of these conjunctions in Earth in 1980 and 81. And then there's one break, one anomaly that was at the tail end, almost 29 degrees Aries. So it just missed being in Earth. And this, as we've seen, is a rather militant period. And then it resumes. So then you have all Earth cycles continuing, or Earth conjunctions of Jupiter, Saturn that continue. So, but you notice that from 1900, and I have a much bigger one that can take us way, way back. But you see that they last for several hundred years, and you see the beginning of the Earth moving into Earth, the last fire conjunction at the tail end of the fire period was in 1900.
Right.
And so from there on, you see this, what I call the mutation between fire and Earth. And you had certain things that we associate with fire and certain things we associate with Earth. But overall, we have to remember that what Jupiter stands for, both in the individual chart and also in the larger, in the macrocosm, right? So Jupiter would stand for humanitarian and ethical concerns, law and lawyers, religion and its leaders, education, especially higher education, but the whole of education is Jupiter. Institutions of learning, teachers, journalism, publishing, the urge for political and individual freedom, thus patriotism. So the aspiration for national identity is huge in a fire period, and that's what you had. So that's what you had. You might want to show the fire chart. We could come back to this one, the one that says Jupiter, Saturn, and fire, and that's where Jupiter is particularly strong. Do you see the one that says fire?
Yes, I'll show it right now. Just a second.
You can go back and forth to this one. But that was a major transition there. If you want to hold off on that a minute. So you've got that up on the screen now?
Yes. Can you see it?
Okay. I can see it small. Let me see. All right, I can make it big by just going to my own.
Yes. Yeah,
so you see that the fire, now this, I wanted to show these for another reason, but you see that is just under our core of the Earth period is lasting. We're right in the thick of it, right in the middle of it, 60 years into the core of the Earth period. And you see here, I wanted to show this as a comparison. You see, you got it starting in 1782 in Sagittarius, and then in Leo, Aries. There's no break. It's all fire. And so a couple of things to note. Fire is very, very powerful for the nation state. And notice that, I mean, there's so many historical stories we could go into. But the United States, the colonies first started to rebel against being colonies ruled by Britain in 1775. But notice they didn't really, that whole war did not finish, was not declared ended until 1783. And that conjunction, notice that what I say as an astrologer, that it had to wait for completion until that Sagittarius. It was a very powerful conjunction at the galactic center in, I believe it was, I don't have the exact date right in front of me, but I can get it. It was 1782. And then literally a couple months later, the King of England declared that there should be a cessation of hostilities.
Right.
And so there, and then in the early 1800s, you had so many countries in South America and Central America declaring their nationhood and their freedom from being a colony of Spain or Portugal. So, this was an era, and make a lot of comments about that, the nation states that were established after anything to do with fire, in other words, after 1961, which includes most African states,
Yes.
or many of them, were very weak because they didn't have that fire of patriotism, that fire of national unity, that tribal urge to join together as a culture and as a people and have individual rights. And the only nation across the world that had a constitution that said that these rights were God-given and that they were not, well, implied, they were not dependent on a government to give you these rights, was the United States. So as Thomas Paine said, he was one of the revolutionaries at the time, said, and I quote, "The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind." And the same is true today. So I'm just giving you a little background on what you're asking about what's going on now, because we see that the nation state was thriving during the fire period. And then if you can go back and click me on the
Yes.
just be
second.
well, wait a minute, before you do,
Yes.
notice that, and now here's another, I don't want to get too technical for your audience, but this is a very important part of my thesis.
Yes.
Notice how, and if you want to put your pointer, can you see my pointer or no? Probably not.
They
Yeah,
can see
I'm
mine.
pointing on 1841 in Sagittarius.
Right, I have it.
That conjunction, okay? The parallel to that in the Earth period is 2020, right? Because it's at the junction, the halfway point, and as we know, these 60-year periods.
Right.
Well, if we don't know, we should. As astrologers, 60-year periods are powerful. It's 5 Jupiter cycles and 2 Saturn cycles. So the Dharma, and of course in Vedic astrology, you have Jupiter as the planet of Dharma, Saturn, the planet of karma. And what I was saying before about Jupiter with all the learning and journalism and all the things we associate with Jupiter, and the ruler of the 9th house, and actually it rules Pisces. We give it rulership over Pisces as well, just as said Jupiter as Saturn rules over Capricorn and Aquarius. So notice that this 1841 conjunction has no stars or anything next to it, the little asterisks.
Yes.
Right. And then in the little notice, I have the little block there where I've written standout conjunctions. In other words, those conjunctions are more powerful. Why? Well, some you'll know right away just from knowing Western astrology. If they're at the solstice, which 2020 was, at the equinox, or at the galactic center, which 1782 was very, very powerful. And you had the French Revolution soon after that.
Yeah.
Well, if anything, it doesn't have to be that year, but if it's within, 5 years or so, notice that framework of 5 to 7 years, or even 8 or more. But usually you can see a lot within 5 to 7 years of that. Now, there's something in Vedic astrology called Vargotama.
Yes.
And that's kind of the way it works out mathematically. And this is in the fire signs. If in a fire sign, the planet is at the first 3 degrees, 20 minutes of a sign. I'm sorry, it has to be, we're talking now in a chart. It has to be in a chart. They're different for fixed. If it's in the middle, like the middle 3 degrees, 20 minutes of a fixed sign, if it's in the first 3 degrees, 20 minutes of a cardinal, chara means active, or you would call it cardinal. Okay, so first 3 degrees, 20 minutes of Aries, Libra, Cancer, Capricorn. That is Vargotama because it repeats in several other divisional charts.
Right.
In the dual signs, you would call those mutable, Virgo, Pisces, Gemini, Sagittarius. Those would be the last 3 degrees, 20 minutes of the sun. That means that repeats that sign, and that repeats. So that has a very powerful meaning. Like in an individual chart, if that repeats, that gives them double of that sign. So it repeats in the very powerful 9th harmonic divisional chart, what we call a Navamsha. So that's a new thing, but notice how there are no anomalies here. It's all fire, all fire. And so the nation state, notice the religion, the period before that, we could do so much with this, which I discuss in my book in some detail, the first chapter, which only goes 56 pages, but it's packed with information and tables of I give all the tables of when I have an annotated table and an unannotated table. So you can go through and just, okay, here's when the conjunctions were. And so, okay, so we can go, show me now so notice that there's nothing special, okay, at the 1841. It's just continuing, right? The trend continues without interruption. The nation state continues. Now, they did try. Now, this is another thing that we want to discuss for now. They did try to do globalism with or the earlier version of it, with the Congress of Vienna, which was 1815.
Right.
But nothing happened for that, in my opinion, because there was too much fire. The nation state is too strong.
Right.
Okay, so go to Earth then, to give me the Earth cycle.
Yes, just a second. Mm-hmm. Let me just open it again because it closed on its own.
Mm-hmm.
There it is. All right.
Okay, and I'm going to open it on my screen since it's easier for me to get it.
Oh. What can
okay.
You can you see the Earth?
Yeah, I can see it in small form, but I'm opening it up on mine.
For the viewers.
I'm sorry?
I zoomed it in from my end so the viewers can see it bigger.
Yes, good. Yeah. Just make it as large. Yeah, good. Just make it as large as you can. So notice with this one, now, again, you saw that larger graph where the 1900 to, I think that was 1900 to 21. So we can see that we're leading in, that we had, and I can say a lot about those years, and you had a bigger chance for globalism. Now, what do we mean? This is a term that apparently first started getting picked up in the early 1960s and was much more spoken of from the 80s onward. And it's much more to do with it could be much more successful in the Earth period, because what you want, well, what do you want? Let's say, the thrust of the Earth period is to give Saturn much more power, which it has incredible power for business success in Capricorn. And so it's business, status, consolidation of material resources and powers, material security. It's associated with iron, lead, zinc, black metals, coal, fuel, weapons of defense. The previous Earth period was like around 1000 to 1285. That's when Genghis Khan ruled over the Mongolian Empire. Yes. And if you know, I don't know that this is common in Italian or Italy, but they were known as Moguls, yes. M-O-G-U-L. And Moguls, of course, that's a term you know, right, in Italy, right?
Yeah. Or Italian.
Yeah, so it's like I just thought of a big cheese. It's a very, it's slang for someone with a great deal of political, financial power, wealth, this kind of. So Genghis Khan, he ruled over, 100 million people, 22% of the earth. And how they did it in a previous Earth period was through financial strength and military power.
Right.
So you see the same theme going on here, which was building up even in the fire to Earth period, especially because, and even, I was going to say, the last conjunction in Sagittarius, which was 1901, which Sagittarius is very strongly connected with the horse. That was the last 20 years of the strong global use of the horse.
Right.
right? Horse and buggy, you talk about the early 1910s. More, how many, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of horses. I don't have that number right in front of me. Were killed or injured during World War I,
Yeah.
right? Because they weren't, it was too much. And they had to slog down all kinds of mud and hillsides and places where they shouldn't have been going. And, so in other words, it was the end of the horse, the era that featured the horse as the chief form of transportation and moving into all kinds of electrical things. Not yet the car, that didn't come. Now, so notice the car, the commercial viability of Earth is amazing.
Right.
Right? Because you have the first car invented in 1885. That's in my book. Here I can see it. It's 1885. But then it took moving into the Earth period. Yeah, it was I think it was in the United States. Oh, shoot, we shouldn't get caught up with these things. Anyway, I'll skip over that. But notice it wasn't until they invented the hydraulic brake system, because they had cars run by steam engine. They had this car called the Stanley Steamer,
Right.
but that didn't take off. They had to have a gas powered car that had a hydraulic brake system, and that didn't take off until around 1919, 1920.
Right.
Okay, so then you had the first conjunction in Earth in Virgo in 1921, and that set things on fire. Well, I shouldn't use the fire image. That things moving, and you had General Motors, you had the first commercial cars,
Right.
and you had a certain ruthlessness as well, which I bring out in my book. How, for instance, the Alfred P. Sloan, there's a whole school of business at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, named after him. He was one of the first major CEOs of General Motors.
Right.
And he had he's given credit for their huge success from the 20s, 30s, and so on. But he was, and this is an interesting criticism of him, which is exactly in one sentence tells you how Saturn is dominating over Jupiter in Capricorn.
Right.
And in this one, I will quote to you Sloane's, and this was a criticism of someone called James O'Toole, writing about him in 1995. He says Sloane's company General Motors, paid significant attention to policies, systems, and structures, and not enough to people, principles, and values. Sloan was the quintessential engineer and so forth. So, and one of the things they did, and don't forget, think of Genghis Khan. Under his Sloan's direction, General Motors became the largest industrial enterprise supposedly in world history, right? And at the same time, and I'm saying it was because of this Earth commercialism, the ability to manifest and consolidate your material resources and take hold of the financial system, which also has other bad shall we say, adverse implications for the individual citizen, because they don't really want citizens to have rights. And at the time, one of the things they did, they established a special unit within the GM Corporation whose task was to replace America's railways with cars, trucks, and buses. So between 1920 and 1960, they got rid of most of the public transportation in the US. Now, I don't think that happened in Europe, but it created the whole, of course, then they had to create highways and all of that. Right. But my point is that notice in the fire period, it just went on, no anomalies and at the juncture, there were no special features of that conjunction at the turning point. But notice in 2020, we had the conjunction at the winter solstice, which made it extra powerful. Now, the one in 1961 was that we've had several. We've had several that have been, I mean, what I call the major acceleration of the 20th century was because we had triple conjunctions. In other words, we had 3 conjunctions in a row in the same sign, both in 1940-41 in Aries and in 80-81 in Virgo, setting up the information age inside of 10 years was the internet. Right, in Christmas Day of 1990, you had Tim Berners-Lee supposedly invented the World Wide Web at that point. So, in other words, the combination of fire and earth makes things move much more quickly. In water, for instance, you had 1679, you had the invention of the steam engine, but it took another 30, 40, 50 years before you had the commercialized version of it that could be used by more people. Right, so we've got things moving much more quickly and efficiently, but the downside is that Jupiter, as you probably know, is debilitated in Capricorn, and also there's another. Okay, this is another concept in Vedic astrology,
yes,
which is called Graha Yuddha. Graha Yuddha means planetary war. So if 2 planets are inside of 1 degree, and they can be in adjacent signs, but even more potent if they're in the same sign. And again, I don't want to get too far into this. I've got a whole article about it in my and on my website. But the point is that, or I should say, and what it means is we want to know who wins the war. And there are different opinions about this. I got my system from Chakrapani, whose whole his whole family of astrologers use this, and I think it works amazingly well. So it's based on the precedence of size, brightness. So number 1, size, number 2, brightness, and number 3, speed. And so with size, you can say, well, Jupiter is the largest planet in our solar system, of course, by mass. But through its ring system, Saturn is bigger. And as we know, karma, and Saturn has a longer cycle, right? 28, 29 years. So Saturn, we say Saturn dominates over Jupiter. Well, you can imagine in the sign where Saturn is very, very strong, especially for business, and where Jupiter is its weakest in Capricorn, it can get really slaughtered. As I believe it has done a lot now, not only from 1921, where they already started to put forth globalism, and that was with the League of Nations, which was supposed to unite nations, but it was really an attempt to take control, as we're finding out with the UN, which basically the United Nations also wants to control nations and basically eliminate the nation state and instead have economic zones. Okay, they talk about this. You've heard this, right, Anna?
Yeah, I have.
They talk about economic zones. So in other words, the culture of the nation, the language, all the religion, all of the things which unite a nation, even with different races, whatever, they want to eliminate these. And so, and now with our technology and with the information system, although I have to say, that's helped them to do that even more. Although you look back at 1919, that whole era, just right around 1921, right? Just there was Woodrow Wilson was the president of the United States at the time, and the United States, the citizens did not want to get into a world war. They had a lot of German immigrants anyway, so they didn't want to fight Germany. So in other words, the whole country basically was against entering that war. But the bankers and who were, this is what globalism is, which gets very, very strong in the Earth period. The bankers, together with the corporate conglomerates, which had everything to do with the founding of the U.S. Federal Reserve. That was another thing that happened between 1900 and 1920. The bankers said, no, we backed England and France, and if they don't win, we're going to lose a lot of money.
Right.
So that had a huge amount to do with the U.S. entering the war at all. Germany should have won it. It would have been, settled.
Yes.
And I don't think they would have taken over Europe. But so what happened was more disaster because of the way that the war was concluded at the Treaty of Versailles. And so you had this, that one thing I wanted to mention that they did without the internet. They didn't even have telephones yet. Most people didn't have cars. Most people weren't flying planes, but they had an incredibly successful campaign, which they're doing now with with systems of censorship over the internet.
Yes.
Which we're beating them. But which they did, they had Woodrow Wilson assign 6 days after he declared war. He started a committee on public information, which is just what they're doing today. The government, or at least our government, I don't know about every other government, but I think government's working closely to censor information so that everybody will think like they want them to.
Right.
Right. And so the United States is a particularly strong, I don't want to say just test case, it's the last bastion of this. So I think many people understand if we go down to this, then everybody does. And so the way that I see, and this is what I'm leading up to. I'm sorry, to finish off that thought.
Right.
Or that event, that Committee on Public Information, which by the way had on it a man called Edward Bernays, who was only 27 at the time. He was invited by President Wilson to go to the Treaty of Versailles, and he was struck by how easy it was to persuade people to go to war. He thought, wow, we can manufacture consent. Right. That was the term. So he wrote about it. So he became the father of public relations. So they had an amazingly successful campaign, using all kinds of techniques to persuade people that the Germans were evil and they were murdering babies and all these things. And then they cooked up an event to persuade people. All these things, as we know. I'm trying to think exactly the event, but it was all laid in place. So notice they could do that even without the technological powers we have now. It was still the same principle to manufacture consent. But what we've got now that I'm very hopeful about, and I'm being backed up by, funny, it's just being published. There's an historian. He's not the only one, and I'm not the only one is hopeful about this. And this is a change from my book where I don't convey depression about it, but I basically am talking like, hey, this is a trend that's going to dominate the Earth cycle. And what I think now, the more I've examined it, more in minuscule fashion, like, hey, this turning point and living through it and then observing, because as an astrologer, you not only observe individuals, but events.
Right.
And you're seeing that, wow, we've got in the period of time just leading into 2020, and then the several years, and I had forecast some changes in 2020 that didn't come about, but I think I was too early. And so what we see is that I'm tempted to bring up, there's a quote which is pretty amazing. It's prescient, if not depressing. It's by Muammar Gaddafi, of all people, of Libya. And he says, the West, I wonder if you've ever heard this, the West cannot be conquered through military means, but the West can be conquered through immigration.
Right.
Have you ever heard that?
I hadn't until now.
Pretty interesting, huh?
Yeah.
Look what we see, it's happening. And in 2015, I wrote about this on a two-part article I was writing about immigration. I wrote about this in August of 2019, and I said that immigration would be maybe the biggest issue of the 2020 U.S. election.
Right.
And I got some flack for that. People didn't agree with me. But it turns out it was. It was, because Biden is basically, he's a full-fledged globalist.
Mm-hmm.
And he's engineered full mass illegal immigration into the United States. They come one, come all. You interview them, they're all invited, they feel invited by Biden. And the UN is helping. All these different church organizations are helping. I mean, it's threatening to destroy the United States. I know it's really impacted Europe. And not in a positive way, it doesn't appear. Particularly when you have a very different, and not to slam any religion in particular, but the Islamic religion does not have a lot of the same beliefs as the Judeo-Christian civilization. And so you see all these, basically Western civilization is under the gun. It is under the gun in many ways, not only through the impact of mass, and this document, by the way, usually these documents have very innocuous names, and they usually mean the exact opposite of what they is. They want to ensure the smooth transition of basically mass migration of people from everywhere. In other words, no nation should have a border.
Right.
And all these nations signed it, except the U.S. U.S. did not sign it. Under Trump, did not sign it. But Obama was all for it. Angela Merkel was all for it, and the two of them pushed for it, in fact. And along with this, you have also the communist, and the communist socialist agenda has also taken hold since the early 1960s. Now, I don't know about in Italy, but definitely in the U.S. Have you seen that at all in Italy or in Europe?
I think it's much muted here. Much
more muted.
Yes.
Well, I just read last night, and it's almost like these days nothing should shock you. But in Washington State, which, as you know, is way up in the Northwest there, Seattle, now they're teaching with this new, and there's a lot of socialist communists who are teachers, are, I would say, embedded. They're all throughout a U.S. school system, which is why many parents are taking their kids out of schools.
Right.
Because it's an indoctrination, is basically, let's instead of teaching people how to think, let's teach them how to be good little slaves, and think like we tell them. And so one of the things they're teaching them is that don't have it right in front of me, but white supremacy is, anything white is bad. Of course, most of U.S. is white, so that's not good. But to love reading and writing is white supremacy, is akin to white supremacy. In other words, to love all those things that have established a great civilization is bad. Okay, so this is, as an astrologer, you're looking at Jupiter debilitated in Capricorn. losing a planetary war. Now, what's even worse when 61, so those 60 years from 1961 to the present, were
Right.
particularly bad with that because it's Vargatama. In other words, in the subcharts, particularly one we call the Navamsha, the ninth harmonic division. It's different from yours. Trying to think of his name, the harmonic. Addy. Addy. I don't know if you've ever studied him. I did, but they're not the same. It's a he does harmonics in Western astrology, but it's not the same mathematical
Right.
divisions. I can't remember his first name, but Addy was his last name. So this one is particularly, I say bad for people who want to live a sacred life, who believe in their country, who are patriots, who are religious, who believe in the depth of learning
Right.
through books and reading and writing. And yes, I mean, of course, you go outside and play and you do other activities, but you still, that's why the US, we had apparently very, very early on in the colonies, we had almost 100% literacy because everybody was encouraged to read their Bibles.
Right.
And so they were literate because and there were very few schools. I mean, they were they're homeschooled, which is where things seem to be going at the moment. That, well, it's not dominant, but there's a huge amount of homeschooling going on.
Right.
So this is you see, this is the Jupiter rearing its head. Now, what is different about this chart from, and I could show you a water chart as well, but the same principle holds as the fire one, that at the juncture, and it's also larger because the water spreads, everything takes longer in water. The gestation periods are longer, but the trend was the same for religion. In that case, religion and nationhoods were very, very dependent on the joining of royalty and religions.
Right.
But in this case, so we have nation states fighting to maintain their sovereignty, right? The sovereignty of their citizens and the sovereignty of their national borders. And you have the United Nations, which is a very globalist organization where we're learning. I did not know that fully when I was writing my book and published in April. Now it's a 12-year, it's a Jupiter return for my book being published.
Right.
So I'm working on the second volume to that, which I thought would be long done by now. But anyway, that's another reason I'm getting back on the horse here.
Right.
But the horse of you're working on Sagittarius Ascendant right now. Scorpio is done. And it's going to be the longest chapter, which is I was just thinking the other day that, yeah, water spreads. The water periods tend to be longer. They take longer to do anything. And my water ascendant chapter, which is Scorpio Ascendant,
Right.
is the last, but it just happens to be the longest. And I did other water signs. Oh, shoot. And I've got one more to go. I'm going to have to at this rate, I'm going to have to make Pisces a little shorter. But fixed water, what can you do? Okay, so what I wanted to point out here, and it is my theory, and you could say, well, is it wishful thinking? Well, this historian is backing me, and there are many signs. Listen to his title. His name, you may not have heard of him, but he's well known in the States. His name is Larry Schweikart. That's spelled Schweikart. He has a website called The Wild World of History, and he's written a Patriots History of the U.S., Patriots History of the World. A lot of homeschoolers use his study materials. He's just publishing a book, literally, I think the 21st of February, called A Patriots History of Globalism, Its Rise and Decline. Now, he doesn't say its rise and fall because they're still fighting away.
Right.
But they are They are getting defeated. If you see a lot of things, like even you look at the COVID, if you look at the whole COVID thing, where you're basically saying, like, if I know I'm throwing out a lot of incidents and events in history. If you look at how Americans were persuaded that to fight in World War I, which, we had to be mobilized, and we didn't have military ready to do that. They had to do a lot to get it ready.
Right.
But when you consider how they did successfully manufacture consent, well, look how easily they did it with COVID. You should stay home. You wear a mask. You stay 6 feet apart. All these things now we learn, they just made up out of whole cloth, it would appear, some of it, a lot of it. And you will take these vaccines, and and you will do this, and you can't go to church, but the bars will be open, and liquor stores and strip joints. And okay, what kind of message is this? This is, in other words, the secular over the sacred, isn't it?
Right.
You can't go to church, but you can go down to the bar and have a drink, or go to your liquor store at least and get liquor and bring it home. I mean, it's pretty blatant message. I mean, did you have the same thing in Italy?
No, mostly when things closed down, they all closed down.
Uh-huh. Well, I guess they've got a pretty blatant agenda in the United States. And again, I didn't make this up. There's no secret to, they want to conquer the US. And unfortunately, they got people inside the US helping them. Because if you can pay people off enough, and it's no secret, although they can't seem to get it out, except in the alternative press, that President Biden has been heavily paid off by China, by communist China, by Ukraine. I don't know who all else. But if, in other words, there's so much excuse for cheating or lying. If it's for our cause, it's okay. It's okay. We don't care. So what we've got is in the US, and so we see in 2016. So what happened in 2016 leading into 2015 was that UN proclamation or whatever it was, saying, oh, you're all going to let in all the mass migration now. And so we had Europe overrun, and then you have, that's the other thing. You got to have endless wars in order to create the chaos. In other words, you create chaos, so societies will be so destabilized that they will do what you say. And you have an unelected group of bureaucrats, which is essentially what the WHO is, what the World Economic Forum is, right? Basically they're saying at the World Economic Forum that, hey, the nation state is dead. It's no longer serving a purpose. Well, because they want to take over, and they also want to depopulate. They make no secret of that, too. So, in other words, the individual citizen is in the way. And Schweikert talks about, it's pretty interesting. He talks about how they tried to do this at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Henry Kissinger he's one of the first globalists, or in our times, who just recently died at age 100. So he had a huge amount of impact. And he was the professor and mentor for Klaus Schwab, who founded the World Economic Forum. And guess what the topic, I think it was his PhD thesis for Henry Kissinger, was? The Congress of Vienna. So so these things, you see these ricochet, reverberations across the centuries. And I learned that interesting little factoid from Larry Schweikart, who's, as I say, I haven't seen his book yet, but I've seen him interviewed. And so hopefully, he says his last chapter is a chapter of hope, because he said, one of the key people pushing for the globalists to take over nation states and disempower citizens is George Soros, who's apparently pulled his operations out of Europe.
Right.
And there's a lot of court cases going against the globalists. And in the US, I mean, seems like we have one soap opera after another, but it's like when things, I think you know this, or astrologers do learn this, that when things get larger than life, something is happening. Oh, there's a great quote. I'm going to use it in my an article I'm going to write about this probably um, another 10 days or so. It's by the Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin, and I would apply this to now, to the not only where we are right now, but the several years preceding 2020 and surrounding 2020, in part because it's such a major juncture. Like, are we going to continue? Are these globalist trends going to continue, or are they going to be stopped? And there's a quote by Lenin, which is, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And I liken that to now, because you have the whole judicial system, which is Jupiter of the United States, turned on its head in order to defeat the candidate in the Republican Party, who was Donald Trump, since there's no way Biden's going to beat him at the ballot box. So they've tried to defeat him whatever way they can. And it's become so extreme that people are starting to, well, it's what it's doing is bringing more and more people over to Trump's side, because it's so unjust what they're doing. They're making up things and then taking him. They're trying to basically impoverish him and remove him. They've tried to remove him from the ballot in many states, and the Supreme Court finally stepped in. So that was the other thing. In 2016, you had, so European Union is essentially globalist, economic zones. Here we go. Economic zones. It started, so I believe this thing, oh, good, these nations can come together and then they won't ever fight again. But no, it was meant for an economic dominance by certain parties. So there you have Brexit in June of 2016, where you had the British voting to leave the European Union. But notice how it took so many years to even, the people voted for it, but they had leaders in power who were so oriented towards the globalists. And similarly, in the United States, in November 2016, you had Donald Trump elected, but the globalists hate him because he's so clearly a defender of the nation state and wanting to protect the United States. So they've invented every possible, the propaganda around him began. He was quite well liked broadly before he declared his presidency. But they've done everything they possibly can to, make him look like a demon. Because why? He threatens he's threatening the mini Genghis Khans. Right? They don't want to lose their power, but he wants to give it back to the citizens, power that they've taken, you see. So when he came in 2016, they were extremely upset. And of course, they did try to cheat, and they didn't cheat quite enough to do it. I mean, they did cheat, not enough, because he was overwhelmingly won. And then I'm among those who believe that he did totally win in 2020. It was the most fraudulent election the U.S. has ever had. And that will come out. It has already come out. But people say to me, oh, well, the courts said it wasn't. And I said, well, the courts never agreed to see the evidence. Right. So we have a judicial system. We have a kind of, I was going to say, bankrupt mainstream media. And they are going bankrupt because people realize how corrupt they are, how they don't give actual information, they give a narrative. You see, fortunately, we have alternative media.
Right.
I mean, is this all pretty familiar to you? I mean, we have a larger than life version of this in the United States, but I believe this is a theme going on around the world. I mean, we're a country that's suffering from mass immigration, the way that Europe I think was and is still suffering from it, right?
Well, yeah. In some cases, yes.
Right. Well, apparently there are many countries in Europe that are, uh, yeah, just, well, part of it is if you have, it's one thing to have, and I'm not saying I'm against immigration. Obviously, legal immigration is great. When you have people just, I mean, if you've seen any videos, because the mainstream media doesn't show this, I think they're just starting to, because they're realizing that people are, well, they're just not delivering the news.
Right.
Not delivering, they're not delivering what's happening. We've got at least 12 million people who've come into the United States since Biden's been installed into office. And probably way more than that. And and this is larger than many states put together. So, and not, there's no system for it. And it's, people are starting, at first they could hide them, but now they can't hide them. So they're taking over buildings and hotels and causing tremendous crime. And plus, you have the drug trafficking and the human trafficking. So you could say, well, how could we allow that? Well, some people making a huge amount of money out of that. So that is being, I think there's so much attention on that now that's another thing too. It's like you see these trends where how can it possibly end unless people realize that there are more sacred values to life than just making huge amounts of money.
Right.
This again is a Jupiter Saturn discussion, and we're not saying you shouldn't make money. Of course you should, but when it's to the exclusion of ethics and humanitarian concerns, then you essentially, and of course they worship. There's Satan worship now that's open. So it's a spiritual. Hey, I finally come to it's a spiritual battle.
Right.
It is a huge spiritual battle. And the more that I look at this 2020, and as I said, I really did think that Trump would be elected in 2020, and he actually did win that. There's no way Biden got 81,000 or a million votes. The man isn't even cognizant. Probably Barack Obama is running the show because it's all, he's a communist himself and doing everything to promote Islam and to ruin Israel. And,
Right.
So clearly Biden is not. So this is a very dangerous situation for the U.S. to have a puppet at the top of the. So between now and November, I mean, right now Trump is winning all the. I mean, if you see his rallies, I mean, millions. I mean, people are just can't wait they'll wait outside in the cold and the rain or anything just to see him.
Right.
And even if they can't get in, they wait outside. It's totally unprecedented. Now, how would you explain this astrologically? It's because he is promising to, as he says, make America great again. In other words, Amaga, Maga is actually the name of a nakshatra, which is the beginning of Leo, and he happens to have Leo ascendant, where it's also where the Petries, the fathers, the forefathers. Yeah, we are going back to what our forefathers, or what he's proposing, and what I hate to say anti-globalist, but it really is. He's the one candidate in the U.S. who is clearly anti-globalist, which is why you see the mountain of opposition to him, even in the Republican Party, which is plenty of globalists, plenty of, and what you could call traitors.
Right.
You could call traitors because they would much rather have the money from their donors than to do what's right for their constituents, their citizens.
Right.
So that's the other danger of the Earth cycle. Tremendous, prosperity like we've never seen. But at the same time, people with no ethics and in positions of political power where they can and have ruined nation states.
Right.
So this, to me, is very much explained in the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. And you see how there's all Earth now from now out to 2080, and then begins the mutation from Earth to air. But we could either see this if the trend continues, and I haven't seen this. In the water fire periods, I've examined looked into the history to see, okay, am I just making this up because we're basically going to be overrun and ruined and the Earth depopulated with a few moguls, with a few, if this continues with no turnaround, right?
Right.
Because basically they want genocide. And they're not if you look back in history, you can see even back in ancient Greece and Rome or something, there were people who believed there were too many people. The Earth is too populated. We got to get rid of some people. If you look at the history of genocide, it's pretty. Then you have Thomas Malthus. You heard of Malthusian in Britain? He was the middle of the 19th century, maybe a little later, but 19th century. Malthusian means very much in favor of depopulation,
Right.
as was Rockefeller, as is Bill Gates, we're learning. Now, I wrote a chapter on Bill Gates in my book. I had no idea he was strongly oriented along this direction. I learned a lot since, but a lot has become clearer as well.
Right.
He's a software company.
See.
Who was mutated into where's the money? Vaccines. Well, you can't, in other words, if everybody is well and healthy, these pharmaceutical companies don't make much money. So we've got to find a way to get people dependent. Right.
Right.
So yeah, go ahead.
So
yeah,
to sum up your train of thought, what would you say, the future of this cycle, up to 2018 is going to bring generally if we don't take some action?
Well, I think action is being taken now.
Right.
But it's really a fight. It's a spiritual battle in the US. I am not as familiar with what's happening abroad, but I understand that, everything's flipped. The people who believed, and we have freedom of speech here. But there are people who believe that if you have freedom of speech, it's going to ruin their power position. So they're very eager to censor those who don't agree with them. Fortunately, we've got Elon Musk. Still don't know exactly where he is on the spectrum, but at least he bought Twitter, renamed it with X, and he is allowing people to speak there. Right. So that's a positive sign. A little enigmatic to know how and why that is, because he's so united with communist China for his. So that's another thing. We allowed, and also under Nixon and under the globalist Kissinger, we opened the door to China, who's, basically wants to take over the world, and they want a communist world. They don't want citizens to have rights. And when you look at all of this, the sacred, all of this is up for grabs now. When you can just kill people because, as the Uyghurs are being killed in China, because they don't want any religious group. They don't tolerate that. But you have American businessmen and others working closely with Chinese communists who don't, let's be blunt, they don't value human life. So this is the turning point. This is what the 2020, and so if people come out very strongly, and I do feel this battle is being played out in a very big stage in the US. But look at this, in 2024, there are, what did I hear? 42 elections across the world, which is almost like 45% of the world. Of course, in China, they're not going to have an election. But I think even Russia has an election, and probably Putin will get reestablished. But so that's, I mean, it's also not that I follow Chinese astrology, but interesting that it's the dragon year,
Right.
when major things happen. So 2024, and I would have before I would have thought 2020. But no, what they did at that turning point was, and they did it from the moment Trump came on the scene, they tried to eradicate him in all kinds of ways that are actually criminal, within the US government, spied
Right.
on him. All kinds of things are starting to come to light now. Finally, I mean, I've heard about it, known about it for several years because I follow alternative media.
Right.
But you have people inside the CIA, people like John Brennan and so forth, that work for Obama, spying on Trump and 25 or 6 of his people, and then making up charges against them. And I mean, all kinds of things that out of a banana republic, but it's becoming known now. See, it's got to become exposed. So what? So that you can reform the judicial system. Hopefully, we got Supreme Court justices who are being intimidated and threatened, and yet Biden's administration will do nothing about it. Why? Because they want them intimidated.
Right.
They don't want a justice system, and they don't care if communism permeates the U.S. schools. Whereas, see, Trump had taken out. They have all these Confucius institutes across the universities. I think he had. I don't know, was made some decree that they should. I don't know if he can do that, but I think he can say, look, they don't belong in our universities
Right.
or colleges because they're basically indoctrinations. It's friendly, but it's soft. It's soft, but it's in the end, it's very effective because the Chinese think long term.
Right.
Chinese are very, very effective.
I'm so
So I
sorry.
think,
Yeah, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I'd like to get, kind of your closing statement because we need Maza has a lesson in like about 10 minutes.
right, right. A closing statement. Wow, how to wrap all that up. Well, I am very hopeful, just as the historian Larry Schweikert is,
Right.
that if we can win this spiritual battle, um, and bring the attention more towards that we are not gods. You see, the globalists want to become, the machine is God, they are gods, they're immortal. No, no, God has created us, and whatever religion you want to put that under, and that is in astrology as well. The wonder of it, and the fact that we're given. I know one of your questions to me in an email, or somebody sent me, like, what inspiration do we have for future astrologers? Well, we have an amazing system to analyze symbols, to look at events, and yes, you have to see what's happening, and you have to study history and study politics, and you know you can't be um, you can't be totally divorced from it. I mean, you may not be interested in it. You maybe want to just do individuals, but individuals too are affected by these cycles.
Right.
Um, so I would say that if we, if astrology is to continue as we're doing it, we need we need to win this spiritual battle,
Right.
that's happening right now, and I believe we can do it. I believe many of the sign. When you see all the farmers, they're being told not to farm, and they're up in arms. I think, and I know all across Europe, they're starting to, the communists or Chinese Communist Party is buying up all this fat farmland in the US. I mean, these things are so dangerous, but they're so, I mean, it's like, how did they get away with this? You see? And so now people have to show their outrage. They have to change things, and they can't rely on old ways of doing it. And they have to, and we also are working like crazy to see if we can clear up our election systems, because many people do not want to do that because they've been cheating very well for a number of years. Thank you very much. And I'm not saying it was just one party, but it seems lately that the Democrats are doing that. But mind you, we have a lot of Republicans who are, it's a uniparty, you know. In other words, the uniparty is the globalist, they're pro-globalist, and they like having extra money in their pockets. And sometimes it's a lot of money.
Right.
So it's ethics and concern for ethics and the individual and the individual's rights. And the idea, so we have to understand that nation states and nationalism, nationalist populism is basically very Jupiterian. And not that we don't need Saturn, but it is so extreme in this period, power to control us,
Right.
that we need to keep working in a spiritual way and make our voices heard, because otherwise, if we don't shift things, and I'm very hopeful we will, with a powerful conjunction at the 2020, at the juncture of the core of the cycle,
Right.
it will be the first core period in well, hundreds of years where the trend is shifted.
Well, thank you.
Not that I think technology will go away, but artificial intelligence basically wants to take over the human soul.
Right.
Right. So I guess, you know, one could talk forever about that, but that's the core of it. That's what a Vedic astrologer might have to say about it. Oh no, I'm saying there are not many. I don't know of another astrologer examining the Jupiter Saturn cycles exactly as I am. Love to hear them if they are.
Right.
But I have presented this. I presented it for the last 12 years, and now in 2019, I gave a talk on this. It's up at my website, so it's been available since 2019.
Right.
And we got the precursor for it in 2016. Notice how we got signals of what was coming, right? In Europe and the US. And now I think we're getting the precursors. I mean, the fact that 2024 has so many elections all over the world, and we've got populism actually winning in so many places. Well, the elections haven't all taken place yet, but the fact that it's coming strong, I think, is a good sign.
Yeah.
Right? Because it means that people are starting to realize, hey, if I let this other trend win out, then I'm going to have no rights left.
Well, thank you very much for all your explanations, thank you very much for joining us again. And I hope this was, you had a nice time with us as I did.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.